Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Wren Sterling's Care Fees webinar. We've called this What You Need to Know. So we're starting from an assumption of very little knowledge. We're going to work through the webinar at a fairly regular pace. So just briefly, my name is Nick Moulds. I'm the Head of Marketing at Wren Sterling. I'll be chairing the webinar. The man in the know is Clive Barwell. Afternoon, Clive.
Yes, good afternoon, Nick. I'm Head of Later Life Advice at Wren Sterling. I'm in my 46th year in financial services, and I'm one of only about 500 financial advisors in the whole of the UK to be accredited by the Society of Later Life Advisors. Okay,
excellent. So this afternoon, this is briefly what we're going to be covering. First of all, we're going to give you an idea of the size of the UK care sector and some of the factors that are influencing both the state of care at the moment and what we can expect to happen over the coming years. We'll then move on to the three different categories of care. I think it's important that everyone recognises we're not just talking about somebody in a care home at the end of their lives. There's much more to consider. Then logically, we'll be looking at preparing for somebody else going into care, different ways that you might want to pay for it, when you should start planning. And then we're looking more in depth at some of the legal considerations and something that I think a lot of clients will be interested in, so protecting inheritance when paying for care. And then finally, we're going to wrap up with the value of a financial advisor in this process and some of the variations across the UK in terms of the means test that is run to decide how much you should be paying for care. So briefly, the state of the UK care sector. The overall trend in the number of jobs in the sector is increasing quite rapidly as well. And we're seeing an increase in organisations providing care as well. And I think if you look at the bottom bullet point there, so since 2009, the workforce is shifting away from local authority jobs towards independent sector jobs, which gives you an idea of maybe some of the strain that those providing services in the sector at the moment are starting to feel. And the reason for that is largely down to population growth. I think we're all aware that we're getting older and quickly. So as you can see from the first statistic there, so over a 10-year period up to 2015-16, total number of people aged 65 or over increased by close to 21%. That's another 1.7 million extra people squeezing into this system. And people are living longer as well. So we're seeing more people aged over 85. And while everyone is living really healthier lives than ever before, naturally there's going to be a pressure point on care at some stage. So bearing all that in mind, I'm going to bring Clive in, who's going to explain a little bit more about the three categories of care.
Yes, thank you, Nick. I think we need to start to dispel some of the myths that we get from the media, social media, and the mainstream media in terms of why doesn't the NHS pay for this. And I think it'll become clear as I talk about these three different categories that all aspects of medical care are paid for by the NHS. That continues to be free at the point of delivery. I think one of the key bones of contention is the various forms of dementia, which is very clearly an illness, but the fact remains that there is very little treatment for dementia. So if it can be treated, it will be treated by the NHS. But what the NHS isn't in a position to do is to provide accommodation. So we start with social care, and that's where, excuse me if I refer to granny, but it tends to be granny that finishes up in care. This is where granny needs help with activities of daily living. So we've all performed those activities of daily living today. We've got out of bed, we've gone to the bathroom, we've showered, we've got dressed, we've got to the breakfast table, we've eaten breakfast. Those are all activities of daily living. And in a social care environment, Granny only needs help with those activities of daily living. She may be taking pills and potions which have been prescribed by her GP. It may even be that she requires the occasional visit from a nurse to dress an ulcer or something of that nature. And again, that will be provided by the NHS. But the social care, the help that she needs with the activities of daily living aren't covered by the NHS. And if Granny has sufficient income, and we'll talk more about the means test later on, but if Granny has sufficient income, then she has to pay for that care herself. The minute that Granny moves from that care environment, and that could be at her own home or in a care home, but the minute she moves into a nursing environment, so here the primary need is still help with those activities of daily living, but now she needs a little bit more help than can be provided by the GP and a visiting nurse from the GP's practice. So there is a registered nurse on duty at all times in the nursing home. Then in that situation, the social care aspects of that continue to be means tested, and if Granny has sufficient income, she pays for it. But the NHS pays for that nursing provision that's in the nursing home, and currently in England, that's £155.05. Only the government could come up with a figure like that, £155.05 per week. So in an example where the cost of the care home or the nursing home is £655.05 a week, just to make the maths easy, then the NHS pays the £155.05. And Granny herself pays the £500, or if Granny's run out of money, then the local authority will pay for that. Finally, we have NHS continuing healthcare, and this is where the balance between Granny's social care needs and her medical needs move to a point where the medical needs outweigh the social care needs. And then in that situation, Granny will be looked after by the NHS in whichever environment is appropriate for her. So it's quite possible to have NHS continuing healthcare in your own home, or in a nursing home, or in an NHS facility. And because the NHS has been free at the point of delivery since 1948, that continues to be free at the point of delivery now.
Okay, so that sounds a little bit kind of subjective, like that could be quite a fluid situation.
Yes, it is, and I mean there are a number of situations where arguments can break out as to where the break point occurs between social care and NHS continuing healthcare, and there's a very clearly laid down procedure to go through to establish, you know, which it is. And sometimes that even takes place after somebody's death. The solicitor, after Granny dies, looks at the list of ailments that the doctor has put as being the cause of death, and quite rightly questions why was Granny still paying for her own care at that point.
All right. Well, that leads us neatly into the next slide, which is the different ways to pay for your care if you believe that you're going to have more money and have to pay for it yourself. So we've got two options here. Do you want to talk us through both of those, Clive?
Yes, I will. Before I start talking about savings and annuities, I need to just emphasise that the whole basis of the means test is around income. And so if the proverbial granny that I'm talking about is a widow, and she has her state pension, she has maybe her own occupational pension and perhaps a widow's pension from her late husband, and perhaps the attendance allowance as well, then it's that income first and foremost that is taken into account towards paying for her care, for her social care, as we described just now. But then if that income isn't sufficient to pay for the care, then savings are then taken into account. And as we will see later on, and I'll just talk initially about England because that's where I operate. If you have more than £23,250 in the world, and in this situation that we're discussing at the moment, that would include Granny's home if she owns it. Then if she has more than £23,250, then she's deemed to have sufficient income from that capital to top her pension income up to pay for her care at whatever level that may be. So savings then start to be eroded. And it depends how substantial those savings are, how substantial other income is, and obviously what the cost of the care home is as to how quickly those savings are eroded. And certainly many of my retired clients have half an eye to this situation arising in the future and are trying to protect and even grow their savings to provide this income later on, because they want to, if they do have to go into care, they want the highest possible standard of care that they can get. The annuity that we've put into here is an interesting option. As you quite rightly say, Nick, in the background to this, that the rule of thumb is that an annuity could cost as much as 6 years of income shortfall. So if we look at Granny's situation, the cost of her care, her income, and say there's a shortfall of £20,000 per annum, then that is the money that comes out of her savings. And it could be that those savings will be eroded down to nothing, or virtually nothing. And the family finishes up with no inheritance, whereas an annuity will guarantee to pay that income shortfall for the rest of Granny's life, however long it may be. And as I say, the rule of thumb is that it would cost 6 years of that income shortfall. So at £20,000 a year, the outlay would be £120,000. So it's a situation where, if Granny has capacity, then she may well make the decision to buy the annuity, or if she hasn't, then it could be the family, and they will just weigh up. It's like all forms of insurance. Do you pay the premium to pass the risk on to an insurance company, or don't you? When you pay, in this example, you pay £120,000, that money has gone never to come back again, but that that's going to pay the income shortfall for the rest of Granny's life.
Okay. So we touched on the finances there. There's obviously some other aspects of someone's affairs that you want to get in order if they were going into care. Do you want to talk through some of the salient points in these?
Yes, I will, Nick. I think the key point that we need to make here is that in a situation where you have husband and wife or people in a civil partnership, there's no responsibility on the one member of the partnership to pay for the care of the other. So, if Grandpa goes into care and Granny is still at home, it is only Grandpa's income and Grandpa's savings and investments that are taken into account in this situation. None of Granny's income, none of Granny's savings and investments are taken into account. And if they have joint accounts, then it's only half of the joint account that is taken into account in that situation. Just in passing, it's appropriate to mention, because it's an often misunderstood situation, that with grandpa's income, with grandpa going into care, granny still living at home, the whole of his state pension will be taken into account. But if he has an occupational or a private pension, 50% of that occupational pension and 50% of his personal pension can be paid to granny to enable her to continue to maintain an acceptable standard of living at home. So the other 50% of that income is what's taken into account in the means test, not the whole amount. Now, my point here is that in this situation, grandpa is in care. Granny doesn't have to use her savings and investments to pay for him, but then granny dies and grandpa is still in care. The likelihood is, in the normal situation, that the house will pass by survivorship to grandpa because it was owned jointly, and granny's will leave everything to grandpa. So he then finishes up with all the savings and investments and all of the house in his name to pay for his care. So after granny's death, whilst grandpa still lives, the exemption that applied whilst granny was alive disappears. So the planning that we envisage with this part of it is that I sit down with clients, whilst long before they need care, married clients or clients in a civil partnership, and start to get their finances organised in such a way so that if one of them is in care and the other one dies, that all of those assets don't finish up in the hands of the one person who's in care. And that then at least protects half of those savings and investments and property for the family. So it's doing things like, the technical phrase is severing the joint tenancy on a property. So instead of granny and grandpa owning the whole of the house, they each own 50% of the house. And then instead of leaving everything to each other in the will, they create a family trust in their will. Grandpa names granny as the first beneficiary, granny names grandpa as the first beneficiary, but then children and grandchildren, even great-grandchildren, are named as potential beneficiaries, so that the money on the first death is held in that family trust, is available to help to pay for care if it's needed, but it isn't taken into account in any means test.
Okay. So when should someone start planning for their own care requirements? And obviously we talked about people getting older, people probably being healthier for longer, but there's obviously this moving episode of strain on care as well. Is there a golden rule when people should begin to start planning for their own care?
No, I don't think there's a golden rule. I mean, it's certainly something that I talk to clients about in particular at the point at which they retire, so that when we're looking at the deployment of income and assets through retirement, I address this subject at that particular point. But I think that the third bullet point on the slide is one that I just want to focus on for a moment, because according to Age UK, there is only 16% of the population in the UK today over the age of 85 that is in some form of long-term care facility, so a care home, a nursing home, or an NHS facility. Now, clearly, there's a proportion of the other 84% who are being cared for at home. But what the point that I'm making is, do you need to make rigid arrangements for this just in case you're in the 16%? Because you're more likely to be in the 84% of people who don't need to go into care. So I think the way that I look at this is that it's something to very much keep in mind, but not necessarily to consider as a prime requirement in retirement. And as I said earlier on, in terms of the annuity, it's a question of striking a balance, isn't it, between saving for the future and enjoying your retirement whilst you're fit and well to do it. And certainly in terms of means testing, the local authority is never going to criticise you for having enjoyed your retirement if at some later date you arrive on their doorstep, needing help with payment for care.
Fair enough. So let's move on to some of the, I guess, the complex aspects of retiring or planning for care even. Power of attorney, something you do a lot in your day-to-day work. Do you want to just explain a little bit about what that involves and why we've added this second bullet point about not being at the mercy of the local authority, why someone would definitely want to take proactive steps?
Yeah, absolutely, Nick. I think a lot of our clients, and certainly most of my clients, have either got an enduring power of attorney. So this is a power of attorney that was drawn up prior to 2007, which enables their children or grandchildren or a trusted friend or whoever it may be to look after their financial affairs if they lose capacity at some point in the future, either physically or mentally. But prior to 2007, there wasn't a power of attorney that dealt with health and welfare issues. So I find myself talking to clients on a very regular basis, encouraging them to add a health and welfare lasting power of attorney to either the enduring power of attorney they've got or the lasting power of attorney for property and financial affairs. And the point with this particular lasting power is that it only comes into play if you lose capacity. So if you don't lose capacity, for example, if you have to go into care because of arthritis or because you've had a stroke or something of that nature, but your mental capacity is absolutely fine, then you make the decision about your own care. But if you've lost capacity because of dementia or a brain injury or something of that nature, without this power of attorney, the family are in a weak position to make a decision about what care mum or gran should have, because the law says that the local authority has a statutory duty to provide care for people in their locality. And my children played a card game called Top Trumps, and the local authority would consider that they have the top trump in terms of that if there is this power of attorney for health and welfare. So I think it's extremely important that is put in place.
Yeah. So the local authority could make decisions without needing to consult the family or take the family's wishes into account, which obviously have some emotional detriment to the family at a difficult time.
No, the local authority will consult with the family, but if it comes to a point where there's a disagreement between the local authority and the family as to which is the most appropriate form of care for mum or gran or grandpa, then in the absence of this power of attorney, the local authority will consider that their point of view is the more appropriate.
Okay. So I think something that everyone is probably keen to know is how do you protect your inheritance when paying for care? Because we've heard about how expensive it is, and most people want to leave their property or their investments to the next generation or the one below. What can people do to prevent this?
My personal opinion is that there is very little that you can do. I've already talked about how couples, either married or in a civil partnership, can approach this, and I cannot see that can ever be attacked by government legislation, because Grandpa is perfectly at liberty to write his will in whichever way it is, and as long as he provides for Granny in some form or another, then I don't think that sort of planning will ever be attacked. But I mean, certainly what clients think about is giving assets away. And I mean, certainly if it is appropriate for gifting to be undertaken and that doesn't impact on your standard of living in retirement, then any gifts that are made whilst you have full capacity and are fit and well, so the need for care isn't foreseen, then those sorts of gifts will never be brought back into account. But anything that is done at a point at which the need for care is foreseeable, then the local authority will take those into account, will effectively claw that money back by saying, well, we consider that Granny still has that money, and consequently we won't pay for her care.
Okay.
We've put on the slide the asset protection trusts, and there's a whole industry that's grown up over the last 10, 15 years or so, where people have been encouraged to put all of their assets into a trust during their lifetime. So not only their home, but their savings and investments, on the basis that then, if they do need to go into care at some later date, they can say that they don't own any assets. And I have to be perfectly honest and say, to date, generally speaking, those asset protection trusts have worked. But I had a meeting just this week with Leeds City Council, and I know that Leeds City Council are doing everything in their power to find a way of circumventing asset protection trusts. And I think if we look at those from an inheritance tax point of view, since 1987, there's been legislation referring to gifts with reservation of benefit. So if Granny puts her house into a trust now and continues to live in it, from an inheritance tax point of view, when she dies, she's deemed to still own the house. So local authorities are beginning to look at this from the point of view, well, Mrs. Miggins, you were living in the house when you put it in trust. You're a beneficiary of that trust. You've lived in that house all the time. You're still living in that trust, in that house now, but you're asking us to pay for your care. Exactly what did you give away when you put your house in trust all those years ago? And I think a combination of local government and national government, will outlaw these asset protection trusts. So, my view is not to do that. And I think in the final analysis, you have to remember that the local authority will only pay sort of £400, £500, maybe £600 a week for a care home. Do you really want to be in the care home that is, only costing that amount?
Yeah, it's just a lifestyle choice as well.
Absolutely, it is. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So, in all of this, then, what's the main value of an IFA like you to your client?
And we're not saying with this that the role of the solicitor, isn't valuable, because it is. But we can take a much broader view of the situation, and in particular, there are regulated investment products which are relevant. We've already talked about the annuity, and only specialist financial advisors with the sort of qualifications that I've got can advise upon those annuities. So it's not all financial advisors that can do that, but also Granny or Grandpa, at the point at which they enter care, they're likely to have a whole range of savings and investments which may not necessarily be geared up to providing the sort of income that's needed to pay for care. So it is taking, you've used the word on the screen, that holistic view to Granny and Grandpa's overall financial situation.
Yeah, and so bringing the whole family into the decision as well can help
very
from an
much
emotional
so.
perspective.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so the last thing we want to touch on is just, as Clive said, he was talking about this from the perspective of a practitioner who works in England. Just quickly, Clive, there's obviously some variations here.
Yes.
What does the upper capital threshold and the lower capital threshold mean?
So, as I said earlier on, in England, if you've got more than £23,250, your capital is deemed to generate sufficient income to top your pension and other income up to cover all of your care costs. In Scotland, that's 26,500. In Wales, it's 30,000. In Northern Ireland, it's the same as ours, 23,250. Other than in Wales, where there's no lower limit, so the upper and lower limit are the same, in the other three jurisdictions, there is a tariff income that applies between the upper and the lower threshold. And in each of those three jurisdictions, it is £1 per week per £250 that somebody has over the lower threshold. So that is an income return of £52 per annum per £250. So that's a 20.8% return. So the reality is that even when Granny gets down to 23,250, the capital gets eroded pretty quickly to get down to that lower threshold. Once somebody's reached that lower threshold, then the capital is no longer deemed to generate any income. So even if it is paying interest or a dividend or whatever, that income isn't taken into account. And then the only variation beyond that is in Scotland, the local authority pays £171 per week if Granny is in social care. And if she goes into nursing care, there's an additional £78 per week that is payable in Scotland.
Okay. Right. Well, that concludes our run through of care costs and how you might pay for it all today. Next steps are, if you already have a Wren Sterling advisor and you'd like to speak to them about care requirements, please get in touch with them directly. If you are maybe watching this on a YouTube channel, you don't currently have a Wren Sterling advisor, require advice on your situation, if you contact marketing@wrensterling.com, we will arrange a free initial consultation with an advisor local to you.